This is a energized room. This is a post-lunch fatigue going on here, definitely. Don't worry, my fatigue is far worse. If I get through this hour without collapsing into a heap on the floor, I'm going to reward myself with another coffee. So, nice to see you all. I'm going to make this as painless as possible. My name is Leighton Evans. I've come here this morning at 2:30 this morning, no less, from Swansea. I'm a lecturer, associate professor in media theory at Swansea University. My various social media presence are all grouped under that: TikTok, LinkedIn, whatever. I'm all the same on this handle at Leighton Evans. I've been asked to come and talk about qualitative methods in game studies, and the first question that should occur to anyone in this room is, why? What is special about me? The answer to that question is nothing at all. I am deeply unremarkable as a human being. I am perfectly suited to academia, though, because as you can see by my arms, I can sit for hours and hours and have pain inflicted on me without wincing, which means I'm great in meetings. But aside from that, there's nothing really remarkable about me. One thing that I have done extensively over my checkered and varied career is utilize qualitative methods across a range of fields, not just game studies. And so what I want to do today is give a very, very brief overview. Now, Poppy's excellent talk this morning has already given us a superb overview of the autoethnographic method, so I am not touching autoethnography. At the back of the room earlier, I stripped out any mention of autoethnography and the stuff that I'm putting today, because it was like, why am I trying to even compete with that? Because that was absolutely brilliant. So instead, what I want to do is just give a brief overview of the main qualitative methods that we don't just use in game studies, but across multiple domains. And then I'm going to give everyone a very simple exercise to do, where the key to it is very simple. I'm going to pose you a series of scenarios where you are going to design for me qualitative research study. And then you're going to feed those back. And then I'm going to steal them and make them into research phase, which I can get money for. Are we all okay? Welcome to academia, my friends. This is what happens. Now, let us begin. What is it that I'm actually talking about? Qualitative research, collecting and analysing non-numerical data. Now, to compare with Jamie's talk earlier, Jamie, although not exclusively by any means, was looking at how we might construct numerical data sets which give us some insight into the video games industry in that case, but video games in general also. What Jamie's talk excellently surfaced for me was the fact, at the beginning, Jamie asked us that question about how many people work in the video game industry in the United Kingdom. The answer for me to that question is, I don't know. There is no way of telling, because the question itself is too difficult to define. How many people work in the video game industry? The first thing I'd want to see defined is, define the word work for me. What does work in the video game industry mean? Does this mean coders? Does this mean designers? Does this mean game testers? Does this mean people working in PR? Does this mean people working in distribution of games? Does this mean people working in the testing, etc., etc.? What is the scope of this? That scope is always shifting. Depends on who you are, and as Jamie said, who is actually asking the question and who is funding that research is a really important thing to understand in terms of who we count and who we don't count. Therefore, my argument for that question would be that this is actually not an objective question to ask, it is a subjective question to ask. Qualitative research, fortunately, is pretty much all subjective, so I don't have to get into an argument about what is objective or not. We are looking at non-numerical data, for example, text, video, audio, etc., to understand concepts, opinions, or experiences, as Poppy went into in excellent detail earlier about the idea of how you can understand experiences of playing games, for example. It can be used to gather in-depth insight into a problem or generate new ideas for research. And it is this notion of depth which always comes up as critical in the context of qualitative data. If quantitative data tells us how things are, qualitative data tells us what that means. There is a meaning, and depth there infers meaning. It's the classic philosophy of science question being reposed. In the philosophy of science, you have a classic sort of thought experiment. Data, scientists can tell me why a rose smells, but can they tell me what a rose smells like? And the answer to that is no, they can't, because that's a subjective thing for each of us. There might be similarities between us, but actually you'd never know. Because what a rose smells like to you and what a rose smells like to you, you can't compare the two phenomena. This is instead a qualitative reporting method when you are giving that information back. So it is asking things, if you like, on a different scale to the quantitative. As such, there are a different set of methods that we go about using to understand things in this context. Seeing as everyone else is doing shameless plugs, I thought I would do the same. So this is a book that I wrote with my friend Mike. It came out in 2000. It was written through the pandemic. So if you do actually go and find this and read it, please take that into account. Cabin fever was rife. I had lost the plot in a major way. So parts of this book might not make a huge amount of sense. But back in 2019, before the pandemic, Mike and I, who had been working around Pokemon Go for a while at that point, wanted to narrow and focus our research on one subset of data that kept on occurring in the data we were collecting, which was parents playing Pokemon Go with their children. We kept on coming across this information about parents playing and how the patterns and usage of the game were completely different for that set of people than from all the other people that we were collecting data from. So we thought, well, let's get into this. So we wanted to look exclusively at families that play Pokemon Go together. We deployed, in order to understand this, an online survey of parents specifically. Obviously, with ethical considerations, asking children about their experiences was not something that we were prepared to do. So we got 350 plus respondents all across the globe to our online survey on Pokemon Go. And then we conducted from that a sample of 30 plus interviews with people who had played the game with their children, and then subject that data to statistics. So we went out and then looked at what we collected, tried to group up themes. I wouldn't call it a critical discourse analysis because that wasn't quite the lens we were looking at it through. We weren't looking at it through that critical lens. In particular, we were trying to identify themes that came out rather than go in with a critical approach in itself. What we found, significantly, again, this was a slide I was doing really quickly when I noticed everyone was plugging their work, right? So I could only remember 2 of the conclusions of the book. It was a long time ago. Give me a break, right? Changes to the rhythms and places of family life was one of the biggest things that we found in this work. That playing Pokemon Go actually changed what people do, how they did it, when they did it, and where they did it. A lot of parents identified that when they started playing the game with their children, it shifted where the family took place. So the actual spaces and places where familiar relationships took place changed exclusively. Really, it can be summed up quite simply. They took everything out of the house. If you play Pokemon Go exclusively in your house, you're not going to get very far. It's going to be a really weak experience at the end of the day. Although they did modify it considerably during the pandemic to reflect this, and we have to reflect on that in the conclusion of the book. But we found through our qualitative research on this, not just what that conclusion, but what that actually meant for people in terms of what times familiar play took place, where was off-limits, how was this conducted, how were children actually involved in playing the game, did they handle the phone, did they not? We found age differences in terms of actual usage of the device itself. this all came out of the qualitative analysis that we did. We gained that kind of rich information set, which allowed us to dive deep into those questions, rather than just asking, what time do you play? 7 o'clock. Good. Okay, I can work with that a little, but this told me a lot more about what was going on. One of the other points that we did find, which I think was probably the most important, was this idea of increased satisfaction in family time. Parents actually said that the experiences they had with children working together in building the profile on the game had a richness about it, which was missing from other sort of interactions that they had. Really, really interesting, because what was coming out of that data was there were very few mediated interactions in the home. Children would play games, parents might play games, but not necessarily together. Screen time for children, screen time for parents, but different screens going on. What this game did was draw those aspects together and create a richer family experience around the mediated experience itself. So here was a fairly large-scale piece of research onto a very specific question that utilized qualitative methods in order to gain a really, really close understanding and deep understanding of what playing this game together actually meant. So I guess that's my background. I've used these research methods in the past to answer a myriad of questions. As I've developed as a researcher over the years, from a PhD student through to being a postdoc, through to being in the position I am now, you learn, if you like, to deploy these kinds of approaches and methods as a toolkit. What is the thing I'm looking at? What is the most appropriate way of looking at that? How can I gain the best kind of information to answer my research questions on the basis of having this overall toolkit to deploy? The skill, I guess, whether I'm good or not at this is a different question, but the skill, I guess, is knowing when to deploy what technique. That comes, I guess, through experience and I guess through an understanding of what it is you want to do. Everyone's approach to that is going to be different. In terms of qualitative research, I like to divide approach and method up, because within these approaches, you will have a range of methods which are appropriate. So instead of autoethnography, I'm going to talk about ethnography for a second, which is a different thing altogether. I did ethnographic research for my PhD on communities of users of the, well, I was going to say defunct, the now nearly forgotten location-based social network Foursquare. Yeah, I am that old. And in that ethnographic research, I used interviews, focus groups, surveys, observations, a range of secondary research. I basically used the entire toolkit to develop an ethnographic study of Foursquare users and understand their motivations for why they use the application, and importantly, what the effect of using the application was on their appreciation of spatiality around them and how it allowed them to understand novel spaces in unique ways. I've also, well, confession, I masquerade as a phenomenologist. My background is in the philosophy of technology. I am a phenomenologist at the end of the day, and the phenomenological method approach is something that informs all of my work. To say that I am a phenomenologist actually conjures images in people's head of me sitting in a cafe in Paris, smoking endless cigarettes, pondering questions like, is this chair a chair? And I would like to do that. That sounds cool to me. If you substituted coffee for beer, I'd be in my element. That's not what a phenomenologist does, actually. We actually do qualitative research to understand the lived-in experience of people, in my case, digital media, how people use digital media. For that, I conduct interviews, I do surveys, etc. It is still concretized in that way. Another approach is a narrative approach, where we might do secondary research, for example, with grounded theory, where we use a number of different techniques, rhetorical analysis, etc., action research. So these approaches to doing qualitative, and I'm putting an exhaustive list up here by any means, approaches are supported by methods. One of the problematic aspects, I think, of doing qualitative research is actually keeping those two things separate in one's mind. When you say qualitative research, people will just often go to the methods. Qualitative research means interview, it means survey, it means focus group, etc. Yes, that is how we do it. But we also approach it in a particular manner. It's often best to step backwards and ask, okay, from what perspective am I actually approaching this research from? So, just to drill down a little bit about what I mean by these, in case people don't know. Grounded theory, researchers collect rich data on a topic of interest and develop theories inductively from it. That is about a bland and AI-generated way of me putting it. When I sat down and did this a couple of weeks ago, I was like, how can I sound like ChatGPT? Perfect. To an extent, many of us will be involved in a grounded theory approach, where we will be collecting data and allowing theory and allowing our approach to develop from that data. Joseph, we were talking about you doing this earlier, right? And it is probably the way intuitively we think research should be done. One thing I would argue is that grounded theory does ignore the fact that we exist. We are human beings. We have particular perspectives. We have had a whole history and life cycle of things which have happened to us and experiences, and we have read stuff. And to be as objective as grounded theory actually proposes is actually a quite difficult thing. The myriad influences that we have as individuals will impact on how we see things. Ethnographic approach, researchers immerse themselves in a group organisation to understand their cultures. So I think the clearest ethnographic approach I ever took as a researcher was nothing to do with game studies. I embedded myself in a large retail organisation, to use euphemistic terms, because I think the NDC is out of date. I can't be absolutely sure. To understand why the space that they had created, their large retail space, did not work. So I developed a sort of ethnographic study of, in conjunction with this organisation, to try and understand what is it that was hindering that organisation in terms of being a smart organisation. So I went into that workspace. Over a 6-week period, I worked in 6 different job roles. After each day, I would, just as Poppy was talking about earlier, I would make extensive field notes of what I observed during that day. In particular, looking at what didn't work. That was really my focus on what was happening in that. And then prepared a large report for them, and that research was published in 2017, 2018, something like that. This approach is extremely powerful, the ethnographic approach. I think we've heard a lot about it today. Obviously, Jamie outed himself as an ethnographer. Maybe kind of trying to deny it, but yeah. And obviously, Poppy's work is ethnographic. One thing I would say, the ethnographic approach is extraordinarily powerful in terms of gaining an appreciation of natural phenomena as it occurs. If it can be done, is often the big hurdle here. Can you actually do ethnographic research on that thing? With many organisations, it's very difficult to do because they simply don't want you to do that. And then we're into all sorts of questions, as Jamie raised, questions about how do we hidden ethnography, do we do covert ethnographies in this way, or do we just stick to the things that we can actually do? So this brought with some issues. Action research is quite related to ethnography. Researchers and participants collaboratively link theory to practice to drive social change. I've been involved in some action research over the years, and I think why I sort of mentioned it as an approach to doing qualitative research here is action research involves driving anything forwards for me that results in a substantive change in conditions. In games studies, I think that's really interesting because action research could be a way in which people could engage with actual development of games themselves, to work with the substitute participants for game designers in order to move forward a particular idea or a particular set of ideas, and then write up that research as a piece of action research. That can be a really interesting thing, which we don't, there are instances of this in the literature. However, we don't see a lot of it. Phenomenological research, researchers investigate phenomena or events that describe and interpret participants' lived experiences, much like the autoethnographic approach, except we do it not as ourselves, said through a variety of techniques, usually revolving around interviews, to try and understand lived experience. And narrative research, obviously, examine how stories are told to understand how participants perceive and make sense of them. One of the things that always fascinates me with narrative research is the misapprehension, perhaps, that it is an analysis of a narrative. Narratives are understood by people. Narratives cannot exist on their own without being interpreted. They are things which exist to be understood by others. Therefore, narrative research should really also incorporate what other people think of these narratives, how we do it. And I know there was mention of Stuart Hall earlier, for example, and Hall's ideas about different readings becomes very important in the context of narrative research. So these are kind of approaches as qualitative researchers we can deploy. In terms of methods, classical ones, observations, recording what you've seen, heard, or encountered in detailed field notes. Observations are hard. Observations require training. To be a skilled observer and observational researcher is a little bit beyond me because it involves a kind of focus and attention to detail, which, because of various neurological issues, I kind of dart off in other ways when I'm asked to pay attention to something for a very long time. And I find that really, really difficult. But observational research is often derided as being subjective, non-empirical, not useful in any particular way. Actually, to observe people in the process of play, if you want to understand, for example, how different modes of input, i.e. controllers, affect the way that people play and experience a game, to observe them actually playing it is really important. There is a large amount of literature in game studies about interfaces and how interfaces privilege particular groups. To understand that privilege, observing different groups of people playing with that particular interface, with that particular controller, for example, is a really important way of understanding. You know, if there's an optimal way of actually handling this thing, how do people actually do it? And how does that reflect on how they understand the game, how they enjoy the game, etc., etc. That can be established through some observational research, actually looking at people's habits. We often don't think, this is an important facet of, what we should be researching on. Actually observing what people do as they're experiencing something is a really important way of understanding how they're experiencing it, because it doesn't rely on them having to explain it. We can actually have explanation from them and contrast that with this other form of research. Interviews are almost always brought up as like the cardinal, qualitative method. The route to the deep lived experience of the person is to sit them down and talk at them and get them to talk. Yeah, okay. I'm not going to argue with that too much because that would invalidate most of the research I've ever published. But interviews can be done in a lot of different ways. I'm currently working on a paper with some colleagues from all around, actually, from Poland, Netherlands, from Birmingham, where we did interviews with students who used virtual reality rather than using another dislocated form of interview technique, and then asked them about their experience afterwards. So they were interviewing and we were interviewing them. So we had a double interview technique going on here. We didn't interview them in VR, but they did interviews in VR. What they said about the interviews in VR were that this was really interesting because they had a different form of embodiment than they would have had if they spoke to them over Zoom, for example. What we found with that was that by having had those students interview people, they were then savvy to the interview process themselves, and the interviews became much more difficult to actually do and to get interesting information out of them, because you had these students like, so you're asking this kind of question now, and you're doing this, and it's like, never mind what I'm doing, just answer the damn question, right? So interviews, what came out of that was a really rich set of information about, how people experienced virtual reality in that particular scenario. Could we have got it in any other way? Probably not. I doubt we could have got that kind of quality information in any other way. Focus groups, big interviews. Well, you put a bunch of people together. Save time, save money, save effort. Fantastic. Focus groups are my least favourite thing to do, I think, because I find them always to be imbalanced, in that there are certain people who dominate them, and it's very hard to change that dynamic, unfortunately. But focus groups can also, I think, be a very interesting source of rich data for people to use. Surveys. I have an undergraduate degree in psychology. Therefore, the survey method became the fundamental way of understanding the world for 3 years. Surveys, incredibly useful in that Pokemon Go book for gaining a baseline of what questions we should ask in interviews. I think that is the way I always understand the questionnaire method. I would never use it on its own, but I might use it to pose questions for further research, unless it could be used in a way where my research questions are answered comprehensively through it. But surveys, I think, are very, very useful for trying to narrow what it is you should actually be asking about. By gaining a wide range of responses on a particular set of questions, things will emerge which you can think, that's interesting. So it's still part of the overall qualitative approach in that sense. And then we'd all be familiar with the sort of secondary textual approaches. I was going to have a massive argument about about textual analysis and secondary research with a friend of mine who works at a different institution, who seems to think that semiotic analysis is primary research. I'm just venting, sorry, this is a really frustrating argument. But we are, obviously very familiar collecting existing data in the form of text, image, audio, video recordings. Now, what we also have to apply as qualitative researchers is analytic techniques. And this sometimes, especially if you're perhaps at undergraduate work, is where things fall down a little bit, because you need a rigorous form of analysis in order to understand this rich data set that you've collected. To have, let's say you do a set of interviews. I collected on one research project 35 interviews with participants, where the interview length was around about an hour to 2 hours each interview. That meant I had 500,000 words of primary data collected. What am I supposed to do with it? Just throw it all into, this is what these people say. No, nobody's going to publish that. So we apply data analysis techniques in order to do this. Now, content analysis is something which I see more and more being used across a number of fields. Whether it's applicable in game studies, whether it's applicable in a lot of things is a really good question, I think. When do you use it? When you want to describe and categorize common words, phrases, and ideas. If you want to see repetition of things, effectively, as far as I can see. If you want to see what things come out over and over again. So, for example, whenever I use in a games context, I would set a market researcher to perform content analysis to find out what kind of language is used in descriptions of Fortnite. I thought that was kind of a neat way of looking at it. So, thematic analysis, which I used in the Pokemon Go book, identifying and interpreting patterns in qualitative data. So, for example, you could apply thematic analysis to interviews to understand how players understand violence in the context of playing Grand Theft Auto 5. That would be, I would say, let the themes develop out of how those individuals describe things. Contextual analysis, obviously we're familiar with this, but a researcher could use textual analysis to understand how news coverage of games has changed in the past decade. We could look semiotically at what kind of words are applied, what kind of signs, what kind of constructions of meaning go on in a range of articles in order to understand how there been a shift over that period of time. The discursive analysis, study communication and how languages are used, sometimes confused with thematic analysis, but a discursive analysis instead does look at discourse and the idea of discourse as a theory to look at how the way that meaning is being constructed constructs how you can talk about that thing. So a discourse is basically a way in which you can and can't talk about something. So here I thought this media theorists could use discourse analysis to study race discursively presented in Red Dead Redemption 2, for example. How race is discussed in that game, how it's conceptualized, and how that therefore constructs a discourse of race amongst players of the game. Hermeneutic analysis, which is something I've done extensively over the years to interpret the meaning of text in wider context. Now, media theorists could use hermeneutic analysis to understand the impact of NHL '94 on the celebrity of the player Jeremy Roenick, which is exactly what I did, right? So, yeah. So, you guys probably don't have a clue what I'm talking about here. But back in December when we did the World Cup conference, that was basically the root of my paper where I looked at the old NHL player Jeremy Roenick and how the public image of Roenick was constructed by how he played in that video game, ignoring the fact that he's a Trumpian sort of Me Tooist imbecile. And that gets elided, and instead this other image which was constructed in the game becomes part of the hermeneutic understanding of who Jeremy Roenick is. So, what do we have? We have approaches, we have methods, and we have analytic techniques. That is how a qualitative method works. Because you have all these different elements together, there are therefore multiple different ways that you can go around studying something qualitatively. It is not as linear a pathway as we might suspect. You can deploy different approach, different method for that approach, different analytic technique for that. So you could take the same game and the same phenomena and look at it in several different ways within this data framework, if you like. One thing that you have to be careful of is thinking that there's an optimal way to do things. And I think this is natural for us as researchers. We look at a phenomena and we think, what is the best way that I can explain this thing? As in, we are going to answer the question about this particular phenomena. What you've got to remember when approaching qualitative research is you are going to answer a question. There are other questions you have not asked, and there are other ways that you could answer your question as well. There isn't necessarily an optimal way of doing this, and you've got to caution against the idea. You have to find the perfect way. Well, find the way that's going to be best to answer the question from your skill set, from your background, from your knowledge, from your position in which you can do this research at this point in time, from what data you can collect, from what analytic techniques you think you can deploy. It is much better to try and answer and try and set yourself up in that manner and try to think, I'm going to come up with a definitive answer to this question by employing the absolutely optimal way of studying this. Maybe, possibly, don't be so hard on yourself. Somebody else could answer the same question in a completely different way to you. Which answer is right? Well, how about both? How about both are valuable for understanding this phenomenon? One doesn't supersede the other. It is important from a qualitative approach that we, from a quantitative perspective, and this isn't what Jamie was talking about necessarily, but there is almost a biased view of quantitative research, that it answers questions. Bang, stop. This is the answer. Look at the numbers. Answer given. Sure, but the way that question is posed. Let's pose it in a different way, and you can go about answering it in several different ways. And all of those could be equally valuable to our understanding of the phenomenon itself as well. So there isn't an optimal way of doing things here. What I prefer to think of in terms of how you actually assemble a qualitative method is, what are you good at? What are you interested in? What time do you have? What resources do you have to do this? And what do you want to, project it forward? What do you want it to do? Do you want it to be the fundamental basis of a PhD? Okay, well, I can see that you're going to need to generate a lot of data here. So you probably want a mix of methods which will provide several data sources, which will allow you to triangulate around a particular set of answers. I get that. Do you want to produce something for a 20-minute conference paper? Maybe not be so ambitious. Maybe do a short online survey where you can present some data to people, in a qualitative form, but nevertheless, you've actually obtained some data, you've answered a question. You can work on that and perhaps augment it in the future in order to produce a full research paper, which you get published in a journal. Fantastic. Think about where this is going to be. That's really, really important. What does it need to do? Does it need to change the world? No. Nobody's ever changed the world. Well, no, nobody ever did. Stop. One of the things I have to do with PhD students all the time is to try and talk them out of thinking that they're going to change the world. It'd be wonderful if you did, but aim a little lower than changing the world, perhaps maybe change the paradigm that you're looking at. That's ambitious in itself. Maybe answer the damn question. That would be great. Don't try and do everything. Okay. I'm going to give you all 15 minutes to design me a qualitative research topic. Now, you will be pleased to know that you are not doing this blind. I have instead given you some topics, and you can pick one of these topics. We have some topics. How does online video game play impact players' emotional well-being and mental health? Excellent. How do non-male players experience and navigate issues related to diversity, representation, and inclusivity in video games? Wide. How do players balance their video game engagement with other aspects of their lives, such as work, family, and social relationships? How do video games facilitate or hinder players' learning and knowledge acquisition in various domains, such as history, science, and culture? Boom, huge, huge, huge. There's loads of scope to drill into this. The qualitative methods that I've been over here, the qualitative approach, is all about zeroing in and gaining depth about a specific phenomenon. What I would like you to do is transform one of these into something specific by looking at what object of research will you have, could you have a research question, what approach will you take, what method will you use, and what analytic approach may you take. Be creative. As I said, I will be submitting these to either the AHRC or ESRC very shortly, so I want them to be good, not be upset.
Or ChatGPT is consulting.
Yeah, well, I might have played around with doing that.
Is John Knox a goodie or a baddie? 7-year-old Scottish girl afterwards. Is John Knox a goodie or a baddie? So you play like John Knox's video game, and he goes out and assassinates those people, and then you can interview afterwards. Then the American Scots die, and see if they hear or no.
Interesting.
Yes.
Interesting. I think it's really interesting.
You're only a 7-year-old, you're off.
Yeah, yeah. What you can do is really pull that wheel apart of things, which comes apart.
Well, that's what I try to explain to 7-year-old.
Yeah.
It's positive methods. Yeah, well, what they video about it? I said, oh, well, it's all about just analytical, I said. Well, but what they video about it? Apply a constant comparative method.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, don't come down to theory of
There's
learning.
no instruction. People own texts. Yes, you contribute to it.
I think I'm not video game, that'd be good.
Well, then we need action research.
Oh, no, Martin Leighton, he was an action researcher.
You named them up on the
Game news.
That would be the most boring video game of all time. The 95 BC. If I came to a place or period, like literally talk about games taking 30 hours or the entire period of the rain, that's how I'm not sure that mission.
Well, you've got the coding engine for Secret Service. What's it worth? Primary schools.
I was going to ask, would you not say
Yes. English finance.
this appropriation more later? But I was going to say, would you mind terribly? Is the master's what was 30 days, the master's was vibrant. Or in the last 3 months,
You're excused.
I can't.
You are.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Please don't make me do this again.
So back, relax.
Bless you.
Yeah, that's sounds like overkill.
Yes, it 100% is.
Just not research, I'm trying to make it change things.
Yeah.
I was copying my research on the thing.
Map it on.
Yeah. Create your idea of it. And if it gives you a fast center, and you've got like choose, run away, and then you do yeah, that'd be very I would stay calm. In Machiavelli, he had like game rules. Where was the exit from? Did you make the one? Yeah, good. So then, and the deep sheets can be in there.
Already in Assassin's Creed, but
And
there's a game of war where it is.
War.
I think pretty sure Crusader Kingdom is there. So.
Well, I'm not saying I'm original.
It's a
This is qualitative
well
research.
mined period.
Yeah. I'm not doing narrative research.
There's also an indie game where you have to avoid Henry VIII.
No,
How behave yours. Yeah, you have to kind of navigate your way.
This is what happens when you let Welsh from the judge. It goes down. The conversion in America would be a license for the period begins there.
So, like, it's a oldie worldy period, like, period of 400 years. Yeah.
Next thing you tell me, Bible reads what's in there. Who made that was in world state about?
World of state.
Yeah.
Isn't that sick?
It's not about the fact. I'm going to play it, and at the end, I'm going to ask myself, when did Mary Queen of Scots die? And I know the answer. And
How many coded it into the game before you started?
I knew there was something.
Okay, so another couple of minutes to pull some stuff together, and then I'll go through each of the topics in turn and see if people have engaged with it, and if so, well, what ideas can I nick, and what ideas am I going to pick? Of course, people will be invited on as co-PI for the project. You know, it's not that heartless.
Got Leonardo da Vinci on my team doing the coding.
Interesting.
Yeah, but what impact does that have?
Da Vinci code, yeah, it's a secret history, it's a secret impact.
Considerable impact in resurrection.
Fail to monetize design, so.
Yeah, that would not go down well with the ESL. Previous research did not yield sufficient profit.
And when we feed it back to people online, would you prefer them to drop it in chat and then I can read it out, or?
Can we do it that way, Lisa?
Yeah,
That's my already adult brain can't handle it.
that's fine.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I think we're close enough. I think everyone's in a state of deep malaise at this point. So let's bring this to a close before you all lose what little will to live that you have left. So, topic number one. How does online video gameplay impact players' emotional well-being and mental health? Should I put and or? No, first of all. So, first of all, marking myself down is a unique way of doing things. Do we have any ventures of an approach to do this? Don't all shout at once. Don't overpower me.
Okay, I didn't do it. Like, I didn't do the homework. I'm sorry, but
The dog stole it, right?
yeah, the AI corrupted it. But off the bat, what I would say is, I think because we're talking about internal experiences,
Yes.
these are kind of notoriously difficult to measure in a participant observation kind of way.
Absolutely.
Especially mental health is something that people mask very well for a variety of reasons. So also thinking about privacy, security, things like that, people might be more. I know you're gonna hate that I say this, but you, because people might be more willing to say something private or like a survey or an interview rather than they would in a group setting, or rather than you would be able to observe. So
I agree 100% with certainly methodologically, that screams to be the right approach. In any kind of context where you see emotional well-being or mental health, almost superseding the interview as an approach to take, as a method to take here, is what you do ethically around the interview. It is not even sufficient enough, I think, to say, well, all participants will be anonymized, because the interview approach itself could be a form of harm to people who are already in distress emotionally or in terms of their mental health. The design of interviews in that way, and having experience and skill of interviewing people to note that people could be in distress, would be very important. To get something, I mean, the reason why I posed this in the first instance was to try and raise something very important about qualitative research. To get this to an ethics committee at top level would be extremely challenging, I would argue. Any ethics committee worth their salt, when they see those terms, should immediately jump on that research and scrutinize it so closely that if it is approved, it is almost, it has almost been the most sanitized piece of research that has ever been done. Because to even consider, emotional or psychological damage to a participant in the course of answering research questions is something that we shouldn't consider anyway. That there is no research question that has ever been written that is worth damaging someone's health over. So I agree 100%. That would be the optimal way in terms of a method of doing this. In terms of sort of an approach to doing it, you may look at it phenomenologically, you may look at it in terms of grounded research. There would be a number of different ways of doing it. I would argue that thematic or discursive analysis would apply in this sense, where you're looking at how people actually consider and encode what's going on in that approach. Do we have anyone in the chat, Lisa?
Steph's just brought up what might be a good question. It's just wondering about the safety and if there are good ethical tools and procedures in place for becoming embedded in a community or culture, especially as games culture is often considered toxic, and things researchers can do, not specifically to protect others, but how they can protect themselves.
Well, self-protection is really important. I think we've talked around this at various points today, and there are a series of ethical guidelines which I think are probably best taken in its entirety. This is the British Sociological Association, that's the title, right? BSA, right? BSA have a very interesting set of ethical guidelines. Interesting as I mean as in complete and very comprehensive around conducting this kind of research. Also, the British Psychological Association as well. If you're ever going to look at any kind of topics like that, I think their ethical approach is absolutely invaluable. It doesn't matter that you're not a psychologist, that the way that they deconstruct how you do research with vulnerable people, with people with health issues, is very, very useful. So what I would advise is, in terms of where we should go to look for ethical advice, it's actually wider than we might think. Try and consider an interdisciplinary approach to ethics at that point. Harm to the researcher is something which is often overlooked. I think it's paramount of ethics committees in institutions that they fundamentally look at harm to the researcher. I had an undergraduate student a couple of years ago during the pandemic who wanted to interview people who had started OnlyFans accounts during the pandemic. I didn't think this was a very good idea. More so, the reason why I didn't think it was a very good idea was not necessarily that the research wouldn't have been interesting, because it could have been framed in an interesting way about platform economics, for example. What I was concerned about more was the motivations for doing this and whether that would have had some possibility of harm for the student who was doing it. This isn't a moral question that I was posing, it was an ethical question. Did I think it was a good idea for that particular individual to study that topic, knowing that individual over the previous 2.5 years? I didn't actually think it was. I thought I can't obviously give you any more information than that, but I thought there was a series of issues as to why it is. There are, again, the BPA guidelines in particular give information about harm to the researcher and how we can mitigate against those things and how to make decisions about how you go about doing research and whether you should do research. And that's also a fundamental point, whether you should do it in the first place, if there is going to be harm of a particular kind. Thanks, Lisa. Did anyone look at topic 2? How do non-male players experience and navigate issues with diversity, representation, etc.? Is there any way we could go about doing this?
I was thinking about like this stuff that's usually called by people as cozy games. So games that are like Animal Crossing, Stardew Valley, things like that. I've seen that mostly those communities are comprised of non-male players. And I think it's really interesting, like, about whether those games are maybe it's because they're more representative of them, or maybe it's just the communities themselves that are more inclusive of people who are not male. Or is it the gameplay itself, or design, marketing? So I feel like there could be a lot of factors that go into why that is the case. So I think like maybe techniques like ethnography or observation, those things could be interesting to look at why this is happening.
I think both could be very, very interesting. In fact, I would argue that you could just about employ any approach and method to trying to answer questions around that. But the object there is really interesting, this notion of cozy games and how there is a gendering of cozy games. There is a huge amount of qualitative research to be done about this. You know, in particular, I think I would sort of take that out. You know, let's ask male players of cozy games about cozy games as well, because I think that could be really important down the line. Once we get a better understanding of what cozy games are and what they mean to people, it's a really interesting approach that you take, because methodologically, say like observations of people playing, I can see how that will be really interesting. But I can also see how every other approach might be really interesting, including secondary analysis, how people talk about this, how those games have been framed in terms of other media, how they've been framed in terms of how people talk about them in different forums, on social media, online, etc. So I think it's a great area to study, and there are a million different ways of doing it, which that isn't a problem. It almost sounds as if, well, you kind of lost all at sea. It's like, well, no. Actually, that means that the same researcher can look at it in a number of different ways and find multiple insights into the same phenomenon to build up a really complete picture of what's going on. Other players balance their video game engagement with other aspects of their lives, such as work, family, and social relationships. Of course, what we all know is to be an effective game player, you have to forsake these devils: work, family, social relationships. You can throw in religion as well into that. You have to get rid of all that crap, right, in order to be a proper game player. How might we understand how people balance this?
So for me, because this is the one I picked, I thought maybe having like a group of people doing autoethnographies and just looking at how they balance it, and then that's as far as I got, really.
I think that's brilliant, though. It's how we would describe that method would be really fascinating, because I think you're doing an ethnography where you are getting others to do the ethnography for you, which in reality is what we want. If an ethnography goes well, that's kind of how you want it to go, where other people act in a particular way and report back to you, and you assemble the insights from that in order to create an overall picture of something. This is a really fascinating way of doing it, where you actually, you deploy the participants in particular ways, and some people might even call it action research at that point as well, where they are pulling together how they balance over that. And of course, you have two advantages there. One, it's not singular. You're getting a plurality of views from different people who have got different embodied life experiences anyway. And two, you have rigor, because you are comparing across different people as well. And one of the complaints made about ethnographic research is there is a lack of rigor. Well, not in my experience is there any lack of rigor in ethnographic research anyway. But if you want to, if you have multiple sort of participants in that way who are contributing to an ethnography, it does give you a more rigorous approach. Thanks, Lisa. Finally, how do video games facilitate or hinder players' learning and knowledge acquisition in various domains?
So I had one of those terrifying moments of realizing how young my students are recently, of talking to them about the Iraq War, and then
Which one?
Well, then saying we weren't born when the Britain invaded Iraq, which of course they weren't, right? Because it's the 20th anniversary.
Yeah.
This month, last month. And so in a good tradition of psychology research, of researching your own students, because they're of course representative.
The fundamental basis of the entire subject.
Yeah. I would get my students to play one of the games about the Iraq War, and then interview them about what they know, what they learned from the game, and do testing on the students about their understanding of this war from the past.
Yeah. So interesting when we can do that kind of A/B testing as well with different games.
Yeah.
So different games have different knowledge structures within them, which is received in different ways by the students. I think that sounds really, really interesting. Yeah, that would be great.
As a historian, I find it hilarious that things something 20 years ago was really history. So this is one I thought of because it's, sorry, I'm thinking about because I am a historian.
Yeah.
So I would do things, what do they know beforehand and what do they know afterwards? Yeah. But I was also interested in perhaps reflect my own in the narrative, because I would also want to know how the history is being told, and yes, whose history is being told in the video game. Yeah. So I think, and I'd want to.
And the video game history is constructed as any text is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And and that construction of it will have a demonstrable. Well, we would argue, right? Will have a demonstrable effect on the kind of knowledge that people who experience it have about that particular historical phenomenon. I think that kind of research shines really interesting light to something we were talking about earlier in terms of ideology, because the construction of history in those games is an ideological construction, and therefore you're aware of it.
I think in one part as well, it's interesting we say it's history. They say, how is war shown in these games? A lot of these games are short fictional conflicts that are inspired from real conflicts like the Iraq War, but are altered in a way. And what does that show? You know what I mean? Like it's a conscious decision to make it fictional, but it's often fictional wars with real countries that played out in these virtual worlds. So what is the meaning of that?
Yeah, and loads of fascinating. I'd love to get students to play Wolfenstein and get them to say, how does this inflect your knowledge of Nazi Germany? It shouldn't. It's completely bonkers. But I'd love to know how that would work.
Then I'll just come at the end and say, oh, I'll tell you about my mother, and shoot you like in Blade Runner. They play too much Wolfenstein.
This is all, again, going back to risk, to the to the researcher. Yeah, you would pull back when it involves killing the researcher.
So I created my own game, World of Statecraft, and based on Quentin Skinner's book, Liberty Before Liberalism. So they've got 5 characters: the Pope, one of the Medicis, Machiavelli, Charles V, and Leonardo da Vinci, and everyone has to play all the different characters one at a time. And as they have to play each character, and they get an interview about how they see history, what they think history is it the evolution of power of states, is it etc. etc. And then if they play all 5 characters, if at the end, is it the case that people who played all 5 characters vote Liberal Democrat because they're reflective?
Because they've experienced the whole gamut of political opinion. This would be fascinating as a piece of research. Much like the Eastern Front in World War II, it would take years and cost millions of lives. But it would be, to develop our own game in this way. One of the things that we don't see enough of in game studies, I think, is that kind of idea. Because there are obvious barriers to doing it. You're not talking about AAA game here. Do we have 200 million quid spare for research? We wish. But I think the overall argument here that to get to create something and then deploy it to see if there's a demonstrable change from an A/B position is something that we should tie around more, you know, in terms of qualitative approaches and game studies. To look to see whether, just as we did earlier with Poppy's talk, we played those games and inscribed, you know, made inscriptions ourselves of what that experience was like. Let's not underestimate how important that can be.
I've got another version for the Scottish National Party. It's called Double Entry Bookkeeping. It's a fake game.
Spicy.
That would be easy to do.
I want to encourage you to try and make this game, because I made a game about my call center project, a Twine game.
Okay.
And I think now we can make games with no knowledge of coding.
We can, yeah.
You know, just enough time to have a go at it. And I got one review from somebody who works in a call center who said this game is horrible. It's exactly like working in a call center. So I felt like my job was done.
That is an Amazon 5-star review,
Yeah,
right? Right there. This is the experience of working in a call center, yeah. Brilliant. Have we got any others to add, please?
There is a question, and then also Nicole sort of dropped her topic and things. It's just on the last question. She would propose like a surveys, interviews, and maybe secondary data, so could use public designer and dev interviews in place of a one-to-one. And then one question was from John. In qualitative research, specifically for PhD students, how do you communicate the significance of the contribution, given the focus on transferability over generalizability?
This is a really interesting point. It's a good place to finish up. There's a classic trope about PhDs, right, that they have to make an original contribution to knowledge. If you look at the qualitative research approaches as a whole, and the way that I've drilled them down, where you have approach, method, analysis, the odds on somebody having looked at the same phenomena as you in the first instance is not going to be too high, especially in the way that you're actually posing the question. Secondly, if you look at those approaches, you are almost certainly doing something that somebody's never done before. So in terms of the value and uniqueness of what you're doing, it's what I always say to my students is, okay, I've got a PhD student who's just coming up to complete, and she's looking at VR in the heritage sector. Now, there's been a few PhD students who are looking at the same thing, conference papers have come out, etc. She's really concerned about the uniqueness of the project that she was doing. Okay, let's step back. Are they looking at the same heritage experiences? Are they talking to the same people? No. Have they done, you know, she did a lot of UX testing with different virtual environments. Have they done that? No. Where's the concern about uniqueness here? You've got a really huge, rich data set, which, yes, other people are looking at this, but you have different data to them. Instead of thinking of it as a competition to see who can be the first to it or who can have ownership of this, why not consider instead that this is all part of a conversation about this particular topic, and you are bringing a major part of that conversation forward? I would far prefer people, when they're looking at qualitative research, to understand that you are contributing to an overall conversation about something rather than giving the unique answer to something. The uniqueness comes from the data that you've collected. Qualitative data is rich and detailed. Other people will not have collected the same rich and detailed information as you. They might have asked exactly the same question, but you will have different information to them. You will have something unique in that conversation. Does that answer that?
I think so.
I hope so.
Mm-hmm.
On that note, thank you very much.
Thank you.